The official title of this session is Sovereignty and Institutional Design in the Global Age, the Global Market and the Nation State. When I was given this assignment, I thought to myself, well, what does that mean? Being a humble journalist, there's a few $100 words in there which I don't quite understand. So I sent a message to my fellow panelists and say, would you mind just translating that into English, a couple of sentences? Perhaps wisely, none of them replied. So I had to think about it a bit. We've got some diverse presentations here, but there actually is a unifying theme. So if you give me a second, I'll try and sort of back my way into it. Seems to me the financial crisis, which is what started all this INET and lots of other things, raises three questions. First one is what to do about those rich fools on Wall Street and in the City of London who dragged us into this mess. Second question is what to do about those not so rich fools in academia and in various policy institutes and central banks who said that such a thing could never happen to begin with. And then the third question is where is this crazy globalized economy beset by whatever you want to call it, Knightian uncertainty, Santa Fe complexity, Rumsfeldian unknown knowns, however you want to put it, where's it going next? And most of this conference has been addressing the first two of these questions, and lots of people in this room have made contributions. As Rob said, I've written a book about it. I'm sure most of the people in this book have written at least a paper or two about it. But we're moving into the sort of broader questions here, the realm of, where do we go from here? What are the future problems besetting that are likely to beset the market? And Bretton Woods is a good place, I think, to start thinking about these things. I may be one of the few people in the room who've been here before. Back in 1998, after the Asian crisis, I thought, Bretton Woods is a good place for an article. I'll do my piece on time for a new Bretton Woods. Obviously, I wasn't the first. Ronald Reagan, as we heard yesterday, had said it. Tony Blair had said something similar. I'm sure Gordon Brown had said something similar. So I duly came up here and padded around and looked at the famous suite, which we heard about last night, where Keynes and Lydia stayed and annoyed the Morgenthors on the floor below. Julie wrote my 10,000-word piece, which was entitled The New World Disorder, and called for some sort of a new Bretton Woods. And of course, nobody took any notice of it. I remember discussing it with Larry Summers, who we heard from last night. That was Larry Summers Mark I at that stage. He was Assistant Treasury Secretary, and he was busy telling the Asians what to do, how to solve the crisis. So, in Washington, the consensus was we didn't need a new Bretton Woods. Of course, in Asia, they looked at it slightly differently, and they sort of created what came to be known as Bretton Woods II, which was a sort of dollar renminbi standard, building up reserves, capital controls, form of financial repression, and worked reasonably well, as we've heard, it seems, surprisingly enough, given the preconceptions of the time. The Asian economies seem to have emerged from this crisis a lot better than they did from the 90s crisis, and certainly a lot better than the Western economies. But I don't think anybody would have predicted it 10 years ago, as I think somebody else said earlier today, that if you'd have said we're going to have a big global financial crisis, which countries are going to come out of it better, I don't think many people would have put countries like Brazil on the list. So that to me is a sort of a warning that we need to look closely at developments. You can't go into these things with very strong preconceptions. When you're thinking about where the global economy is going, it is such a complicated system that any sort of general declarations are going to be a bit hazardous. Seems to me, what I always remember about Keynes was he's a great theorist, but I also remember his statement that economists should actually be like dentists. He said economic science will have made progress when economists are like dentists. You come to them with a disease, and tooth disease, and they say, oh, this is what you need. You need a filling, you need that taken out, you need a bridge or whatever. So I see this session as a bit of sort of economic dentistry. The panelists here are talking about what I would say certain sort of future diseases which are maybe coming on the horizon, or if not diseases, certainly conditions, and they're starting to think about how we should deal with them. Now, as I said, the papers are quite diverse, but they all talk about capital flows in one way or the other. We've got a piece from a presentation from Andy Haldane of the Bank of England on financial flows into developing economies. We've got a piece on real capital flows in sort of new trade theory, industrial flows, by Delia Martin. And then Ian Goldin is going to talk about human capital flows, migration. It's a neglected subject, migration, economic development. And then Marlene Janssen is going to talk about the role of institutional investors, again reverting to financial capital flows. As I said, in a sense, it does all go back to Bretton Woods, because obviously the big issue on of the conference, or one of the big issues, was how to deal with international flows of capital. And over time, obviously, the question has just got more and more pressing. So without further ado, I'll introduce Andy Haldane from the Bank of England to give his presentation. Just a quick word about Andy. We're both from Leeds in Yorkshire, so this may be the first time at any global economics conference we've had two Leeds economists on the stage. He also has done some very good stuff for the Bank of England in recent years. The Bank of England has come out with all sorts of innovative studies and innovative papers, and several of them have had Andy's name attached to them, including this one.
Thank you, John. Thank you to Rob and to George for having me here, for inviting me. I want to talk about an old problem in international finance, a problem that's at least 150 years old. But it's also a problem that is very much of today, of the last year or two. And what I want to argue in my presentation is that it's going to be, in some ways, prospectively, an even bigger problem tomorrow. So what is this problem? I'm going to label it the big fish, small pond problem. What am I talking about? What I'm talking about is capital surges into emerging markets from advanced economies. So the capital provided by the big, advanced, developed country markets, they're the big fish in this story. And the small pond, that's the recipient. They're the small, embryonic capital markets in the emerging world. And when those two things collide, there is the potential for problems. Here's some pictures that speak to the sort of problems we've seen just of late. So left-hand side picture has blue line here is capital flows cumulatively into emerging markets during the course of last year, a surge into emerging markets, mirrored in large part by a spike up, as you might expect, in asset prices, not just equity prices, but bubbly property markets as well. On a longer term view, that's the right-hand side panel, the pattern is much the same, particularly virulent during the course of this century, where portfolio investment in particular has been a much bigger part of the story over the last 10 or 15 years than it has in the period before. I want to tell a story about why I think that was. People have told conjunctural stories about what went on last year. There's a QE story that could be used to explain these sort of dynamics. But I want to tell a longer term one, because I think this pattern, this problem, is best seen as the end point of an evolutionary cycle over the last 25 years or so. Just to put those flows, though, into some context, this just scales them relative to the size of the domestic capital markets in the countries receiving those flows. So countries along the bottom here, a bunch of Asian ones, some Latin American ones. And the red dots scales those flows last year relative to domestic market cap. On average, they were around 4% of market cap, which is somewhat greater than the scale of flows that preceded the Asian financial crisis. And in many of these countries, what we saw in response, of course, was a whole slew of measures, restrictions on capital flows, macroprudential measures of various types, means of throwing grit in the wheels of international finance. So what is it structurally that lies behind this emerging problem? I'm going to show you some pictures of the global financial network the interconnection that Gordon Brown spoke about in the previous session between different sovereign states in terms of their external assets and liabilities and how those have evolved over the last quarter century. So here's the picture. So let me spend a second explaining what this is about. So the yellow, all the dots are countries, and the size of the dots measures the scale of the sum of external assets and liabilities. The links between them show the directional stocks, external asset stocks between any two countries. The thicker the line, the bigger the stock. Okay? And the yellow dots in the center, the core, they're advanced countries. The green and the red dots on the periphery are emerging economies and some offshore financial centers. So we have the advanced in the core and the emerging on the periphery. In 5-year spans out to 2005, what are the two key takeaways from this? Well, one is, as you can see, this network spider is getting progressively fatter. So over the course of that 25-year span, total external asset stocks increased roughly 20-fold. Second point to take away is that if you look at the pattern of those flows, the greatest concentration of those flows, the greatest degree of integration has been among the core, within the body of the spider, the yellow dots. So the proportion of intra-advanced country stocks in 1980 was about 75%. Fast forward 25 years, by 2005, the proportion of purely advanced country interconnectivity had risen, actually, to around 80%. So this is a spider that's getting fatter as it gets older, but its body is getting fatter than its legs. And that'll be a feature familiar to many of the middle-aged men in this room, I think. So let's then take a different cut of these same data. And this cut looks at a subset of those flows. It looks at this looks at the equity, the portfolio interconnectivity between these same sets of countries over the same period. Although the before and after comparison is hard to do, let me tell you two key features about this picture of increasing global integration. First of all, the degree of integration is an order of magnitude greater than for total flows. So between 1980 and 2005, the density of the spider is 200 times fatter at the end than at the beginning. Point two is that integration is happening to an increasing degree as between advanced and emerging markets. It's no longer concentrated in the core. At the start of the period, the flows, the stock between advanced and emerging market is around 1%, a bit less than 1%. By the end, it's around 8%. There has been a discernible shift from core to periphery in the accumulation of portfolio stocks. So whereas the earlier spider, as it got older, got fatter, but the body ended up fatter than the legs, the reverse is true when we look at the portfolio dimension. So what's going on here? What are the portfolio allocations that have given rise to this pattern? This table speaks to that. This looks at measures of home bias for a set of developed and emerging economies. It's indexed between 1 and 0. A level of 1 implies that home bias is complete. That is to say, in the portfolios of the countries involved, they hold 0 in foreign equity. And a value of 0, by contrast, implies that that country holds the market portfolio, holds its equity in proportion to each country's share in the global market portfolio. What's going on here? Well, the key point is that over the course of the last 15 years or so, there's been a pretty dramatic, in historical terms, shift downwards in the degree of home bias in the equity portfolios of advanced economies. So the total advanced G20 here, the home bias measure falls from about 0.8 to about 0.6. In index terms, that doesn't sound especially dramatic, but in money terms, this is quite something. This is a reallocation from advanced to emerging markets of around $4.5 trillion, which relative to the equity market capitalization of the recipient countries is about 2/3. Okay? So for this period, the implied flows are $4.5 trillion, the market cap of the recipient countries around just over 6.5. So this is one of the structural factors I'm arguing has underpinned this reallocation of capital from advanced to emerging markets, the big fish entering the smallish pond.
5 minutes, Andy.
Thank you. And the question then becomes, is this problem set to get bigger or lesser over time? These are the forces shaping patterns looking ahead. We've got home biases being reduced in both emerging markets and advanced countries, respectively. We've also got emerging markets becoming themselves a bigger slice of the global pie. How will this foot race between the elimination of home bias on the one hand and the plumping up, the fattening of emerging capital markets on the other play out? What I've done in the paper, which is on the bank's website around now, is to try and simulate forward how this balance between those two factors might evolve. And I've used the simplest possible little framework for doing that simulation. I've conditioned it on economic development, on the path of GDP per capita in the countries concerned. Luckily, that bears a reasonably close relationship to the variables I'm trying to simulate. This just shows the relationship between GDP per cap and home bias. It's, as you expect, downward sloping. The more economically advanced you are, the more financially sophisticated, the lower the implied home bias. So taking that simplest possible economic development single factor model, I'm going to simulate forward, somewhat heroically, home bias for the next 40 years and financial depth in emerging markets for the next 40 years and compare the two and ask whether this BFSP problem is getting any greater or lesser. This shows an evolutionary path in home biases from these simulations. It shows them falling, particularly dramatically so within the advanced countries. That is, other things equal, a reallocation of capital from advanced to emerging. This just shows the simulation as it applies to the market portfolio between 2010 and 2050. What we see here is the growing role of the emerging world in that global portfolio. So 2010, roughly 2/3 of the market portfolio is advanced. By 2050, it's around 1/3. It's fallen by half. India and China by 2050 account for a fully 1/3 of the global market portfolio. So combining those four factors I showed in the slide before last, endogenously with my simulation, what is the net balance of these factors? This is the chart I showed you earlier on, but instead of now showing historic data for 2010, this is average expected inflows relative to market capitalization for the same countries on average between 2010 and 2050. Those are the blue dots on that picture. Those average inflows are roughly double those we saw in 2010, which you can see if I just add those. The red dots here are the 2010 flows. The blue are the average looking forward for the next 40 years. The green bars show the possible degree of variation year by year. On average, double what we've seen, with a range that often would be into double digits. So if we were concerned about this big fish, small pond problem in 2010, the message from these, albeit back of the envelope illustrative simulations, is that that problem could get a lot worse before it starts getting better. If so, we're into serious public policy territory. What is the right remedial policy response to lean against these trends? Well, it's many of the same things we've seen many emerging markets do over the last year or two. There is a debate, a very active one, over the last year, 6 months, about the appropriate role of capital restrictions. Are those better seen as a last resort measure once the ammunition in conventional macro policies has been used? Are they better thought of as a complement to those conventional macro instruments? We've come a long way in the last 12 years. Back in 98, you remember when Malaysia stuck on capital controls and Hong Kong intervened in their stock market, they were castigated by the international community in a way that hasn't been true to anything like the same extent over the last year or so. So first to last resort, temporary or permanent. Do we want to graduate those restrictions according to the type of inflows that are taking place? Secondly, macroprudential policy. We've seen plenty of that by these recipient country emerging markets over the last 12 months. I find it odd that while many people still remain somewhat skeptical of the case for capital flow restrictions, they're happy at the same time to be fully accepting of macroprudential policies. These two things are not so different. These are not black and white. These are points in a spectrum which meet in the middle. There's a real question about how we meld together this emerging macroprudential apparatus with the case for capital flow restrictions. And finally, my final point, because my time is up, would be what is the appropriate role of the international financial community in overseeing restrictions or policies of this type. The pictures I showed you, the network I showed you, suggested that network externalities are possible, and therefore that there is some role prospectively for a supranational agency in setting some rules of the road for international finance. But finding the right balance between the rules of the road set supranationally and leaving nation states the discretion to do what they think might be best to protect themselves is an issue that maybe we might pick up in the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Andy, for that interesting presentation.